Imagine you're living in 1971, watching ordinary students turn into sadistic prison guards in just 6 days. Terrifying, isn't it? But here's the twist. None of it was actually real. They were simply following instructions. Everything you know about the Stanford prison experiment is a myth, quietly dismantled by patient researchers who listened again. The screaming, the breakdowns, the guards who supposedly discovered a monster inside themselves, all of it fabricated. Researchers finally listened to the original tapes. What they reveal is not a descent into evil at all. It's a performance, a coached, directed, and carefully edited performance that fooled psychology for half a century. So what actually happened inside that quiet basement in 1971? Picture a warm summer in Palo Alto. August 1971. Psychology professor Philip Zimbardo converts the basement of Stanford's Jordan Hall into a fake prison. He hangs a sign, installs iron bars, sets up a small observation room with hidden cameras inside. Then he recruits 24 male students through a small newspaper ad. Half become guards, half become prisoners. A single coin flip decides exactly who is who. The plan sounds simple, almost innocent in its scope. Watch what happens when normal people are suddenly handed power. Zimbardo predicts the experiment will run 2 weeks. It ends after just 6 days. Prisoners are set to break down. Guards invent cruel new punishments. One young man reportedly screams until he must be released. Zimbardo shuts it down and tells the world. His conclusion becomes one of the most widely repeated ideas in all of modern psychology textbooks today. Give an ordinary person a uniform, a role, and a little authority, and they become a monster. The situation, not the person, produces evil. Textbooks embrace it. Documentaries dramatize it endlessly for many decades. Journalists cite it every time a soldier tortures a prisoner or a bureaucrat quietly signs off on horror. Abu Ghraib? Stanford. Rwanda? Stanford. Nazi Germany? Stanford. The myth explains nearly every atrocity in modern history. For 50 years this study was a mirror, telling you that under the right conditions you'd do the same. That evil wasn't out there, it was inside you, waiting for a costume. Or so we believed. But turns out the tapes tell a completely different story about what really happened inside that basement lab. In 2018, French filmmaker Thibault Letexier went digging through Stanford's dusty archives to make a documentary. But as he listened to the original audio recordings, something felt deeply wrong. The guards hadn't invented cruelty. They had been briefed on it. On one tape, the warden, graduate student David Jaffe, is heard coaching guards. Before the experiment even begins, Jaffe tells them the prisoners must feel powerless. He tells them to be tough. He gives specific ideas for humiliating inmates. When one guard resists, saying he doesn't want cruelty, Jaffe pushes back. He reminds him the experiment depends on their toughness. He tells him the researchers need this exact behavior. This is not neutral observation. This is direction. It's a film set, not a psychology lab, a crucial distinction. For decades, Zimbardo told the public guards were free to interpret their roles however they wished. Tapes proved otherwise. The guards were given a script, a tone, a mood. The cruelty everyone remembers as spontaneous was actually requested. Requested, rehearsed, and rewarded. And that was only the first lie hiding inside the dusty Stanford archive. Consider Dave Eshleman. He was the most infamous guard, nicknamed John Wayne by prisoners for his casual sadism. For decades he stood as ultimate proof of Zimbardo's theory, a normal college kid transformed into a tyrant. But Eshleman himself later admitted the truth. He was acting. He had watched the film Cool Hand Luke. He modeled his character on the sadistic prison captain from that movie, giving researchers what they seemed to want. He treated the experiment as improv theater. He wasn't becoming cruel, he was performing cruelty on purpose. Now consider Douglas Korpi, the prisoner whose emotional breakdown became the signature moment of the entire experiment. On camera he screams, he begs to be released. He appears to be completely losing his mind. Zimbardo cites this collapse as proof of how quickly a prison environment destroys the fragile human psyche. But here's the twist. Korpi has said repeatedly, on record, that he was actually faking the whole breakdown. He wanted out because he had exams to study for and was told he couldn't simply leave the study. So he did what any panicked student would do. He performed a breakdown convincing enough to get released. Now look at how the volunteers were recruited. The newspaper ad specifically mentioned prison life, not generic psychology. Later studies show people who answered such ads scored higher on aggression, authoritarianism, and social dominance measures. The sample wasn't random. It was self-selected for the exact traits the experiment would then dramatically discover. And finally, Zimbardo himself did not sit behind a one-way mirror and observe. He cast himself as the prison superintendent. He walked the halls, he gave orders, he shaped the emotional atmosphere. Not a scientist watching a phenomenon, he was the director of the play. If it was scripted, why did the world believe it for decades? Part of the answer arrived in 2001, when the BBC funded a full replication by two British psychologists. Alex Haslam and Stephen Riker ran the same basic setup. Ordinary volunteers, a mock prison, guards, prisoners, cameras rolling. But this time, one thing was different. The guards were not coached. They were not told to be tough. No warden briefed them that the experiment needed cruelty. They were simply placed in the role and observed. The result? Nothing like Stanford. The guards did not spiral into sadism. Many felt uncomfortable exercising authority over others. They hesitated. They negotiated. Some refused to enforce rules they found unfair. Meanwhile, the prisoners did not break down. They organized. They talked to each other. They pushed back against arbitrary punishment inside the mock prison walls. At one point, the prisoners essentially took over, forming a small cooperative community with the more sympathetic guards. Haslam and Riker drew a very different conclusion. Cruelty is not automatic. Roles alone do not corrupt people. What actually produces group harm is identification with a cause and permission from a leader framing harm as necessary. In other words, evil is not situational, it's ideological. It needs a story, it needs a voice. A voice saying, this is right, this is required, this is your duty. That is how cruelty is born. Which means the real culprit wasn't human nature at all. Once you see this pattern, it appears everywhere. Take Abu Ghraib. For years, the abuse of Iraqi prisoners was explained as a Stanford-style eruption of cruelty. Bad situation, ordinary people, inevitable cruelty. But investigations later revealed something entirely different beneath the surface story. There was a chain of command. There were interrogation techniques encouraged from above by senior military leaders. There were leaders framing dehumanization as patriotic duty. Soldiers who resisted were pressured. Soldiers who complied were praised. It wasn't the uniform that produced the torture. It was the instructions hidden inside the uniform itself. Or take Stanley Milgram's famous obedience studies, where subjects supposedly delivered electric shocks to strangers on command. Why? Because a man in a lab coat told them to keep pressing the button again and again. Reanalysis of Milgram's own archives shows that many participants actually resisted, argued, refused, and questioned the experimenter. The clean 65% obedience figure hides a messier picture of hesitation, refusal, and moral struggle throughout. Milgram's story was cleaner than his data. But here's the thing. The myth still shapes textbooks today. The same pattern hit the bystander effect, born from the murder of Kitty Genovese in 1964. For decades, textbooks claimed 38 witnesses watched her die on a New York street and did nothing. Later reporting showed that number was inflated. Several people did try to help her that terrible night. The story was largely a newspaper invention. Yet the bystander effect became a pillar of social psychology. you start to see a pattern. Dramatic finding, simple villain, weak evidence, massive fame, then quiet correction later. This is what social psychologists now call the replication crisis. Beautiful stories built on very shaky foundations. Famous studies on priming, power poses, willpower, situational cruelty failed to hold up when repeated with modern rigor. So how did one flawed basement study fool a whole science? The answer isn't science, it's storytelling. Zimbardo was a brilliant communicator. He controlled the narrative, inviting journalists into the basement before peer review. He gave interviews, shaped how footage was edited, wrote books, appeared on television. By then, he was famous. When critics questioned the methodology, the story had already escaped the laboratory and lodged itself deep in culture. And the story landed at exactly the right cultural moment. 1971. Vietnam was tearing America apart. My Lai exposed atrocities by ordinary young soldiers. Watergate loomed. People wanted to know how good citizens turned monstrous. Zimbardo offered a comforting answer. It's not us, it's the situation. Change the situation and the evil disappears. That message spread because it soothed. It absolved individuals and let institutions off the hook by blaming abstract forces. Textbook authors copied it because it was clean, memorable, and dramatic. Nobody went back to the original archives. Nobody listened to the tapes. Textbooks quoted textbooks that quoted textbooks. The original evidence quietly became irrelevant. Psychology, like any field, rewards attention. And attention rewards stories with villains, twists, and shocking moral lessons. Rigor is invisible. Nuance does not trend. The field kept the myth alive because the myth kept it visible. But here's the thing, this isn't just academic. It quietly changes how you see yourself every day. Think about what the Stanford story quietly taught you. That you are one uniform away from casual cruelty. That your character is a thin costume stretched over a darker default, hiding just underneath the outer surface. That if the wrong situation arrived, you would suddenly become someone you could not even recognize in yourself. Maybe you've told yourself this story. Maybe you've comforted yourself with it in a strange, quiet way. Because if evil is automatic, then no one is truly responsible for any of it, including you yourself. But turns out that tapes suggest something different. Your brain resists cruelty far more than you actually assume. Ordinary people, without coaching, do not slide easily into cruelty. They hesitate, they question, they look for exits, they negotiate with authority, they form small alliances against unfairness. The default is not sadism at all. The default is confusion and moral discomfort. Cruelty requires something extra to override that hesitation inside us. It needs a story that says, this person deserves it. It needs a voice saying, this behavior is required. It needs a group that says, everyone else is doing it. Without those ingredients, most people simply refuse. Your consent matters. The situation is real. Systems are powerful. But you are not a passive vessel absorbing everything. You are a filter. You choose which orders to follow, which framings to accept, which stories to believe. Every time you notice that choice, you weaken the myth of automatic evil. Awareness is your first defense. Once you know that cruelty is coached, you can hear the coaching. You can spot the warden's suggestions. You can recognize the John Wayne character being suggested to you. You can decide, quietly, not to play along. But here's one uncomfortable question the tapes leave open. Why do we love dark stories about ourselves so much? Why did Stanford spread not despite its bleakness, but because of it? Something oddly comforting lives in that darkness. The idea that humans are secretly monsters removes the burden of moral effort. It excuses the failures of leaders. It converts choices into inevitabilities. If we're all just gods waiting for a uniform, no one is uniquely responsible. Everyone was going to do it eventually. The horror becomes weather, something that happens to us, not something done. But real evil, when you look closely, is not weather. It is chosen. It is coached. It is permitted. It has authors, scripts, and a warden reminding guards what is expected. Take away the coaching and cruelty starves. That is a heavier truth than the Stanford myth because it puts responsibility back where it belongs. On the leaders who frame the story. On the systems that reward it. On the individuals who quietly agree. Here's the uncomfortable question. If Stanford is a lie, how many other classics on your bookshelf are also lies? How many experiments about human nature are just well-produced theater from an era when psychology chased headlines over data? Because Stanford is only one of many textbook lies still sitting quietly on the shelves of your favorite classrooms. If you want to see how deep this rabbit hole goes, watch the Milgram reanalysis video cued right next. The story of obedience isn't what you were taught, and the archives hold the same quiet correction Stanford revealed. It reshapes how you see every uniform, every order, every moment authority whispers, "This is how things must be." Ask honestly, if you'd stood in that basement, hearing the warden demand your toughness, would you have obeyed him? Would you have refused? Or performed just enough cruelty to be useful, telling yourself later it wasn't really you? Write your answer in the comments, not the flattering one, the real one you'd rather nobody ever actually saw. Subscribe if you want more debunked classics, the ones that shaped how you see yourself without you ever noticing. Because the next myth we break might just be one you still quietly believe.